Bienvenidos a todos y todas a este acto. Tenemos el honor y la gran satisfacción de contar con nosotros a una persona muy importante en el campo de la investigación educativa sobre inclusión. Ella es la profesora Sheila Riddell, catedrática de la Universidad de Edimburgo, en Escocia, y es una de las referentes en investigación sobre educación inclusiva. Dirige el Centro de Investigación sobre Inclusión y Diversidad de la Universidad de Edimburgo, donde realizan investigaciones punteras sobre educación y derechos de los niños y jóvenes con necesidades especiales. La verdad que resumir el currículum de la profesora Riddell no es fácil. Ella lleva muchos años trabajando en educación, ha sido decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de Stirling en Escocia. Ha trabajado también como directora del Centro de Investigación sobre Discapacidad en la Universidad de Glasgow, también en Escocia. Desde 2003 dirige el Centro de Investigación que he mencionado anteriormente sobre inclusión educativa en la Universidad de Edimburgo, y sus publicaciones son numerosas, hasta el punto que ha publicado en las mejores revistas internacionales sobre educación. Ella también pertenece a distintas sociedades de investigación en Reino Unido y además es profesora habitual de la Universidad de Gothenburg en Suecia, donde hace unos años recibió la consideración de doctora honoris causa por esta universidad sueca. Realmente insisto en que somos muy afortunados de contar con la presencia de la profesora Riddell aquí en Burgos. Ella amablemente está colaborando con el grupo de investigación que tengo el gusto de dirigir, el grupo EdInTech, en la investigación sobre los derechos de los niños y jóvenes con necesidades específicas de apoyo educativo. Realmente estamos muy agradecidos también de que ella colabore con nosotros, de que ella quiera estar con nosotros trabajando. Os invito a que después de su intervención sobre la situación de la educación de los niños con necesidades adicionales de apoyo educativo, como llaman en Escocia, que después de esa intervención participemos todos en un coloquio donde podamos preguntar y dialogar con la profesora Riddell, que seguramente tiene mucho que contarnos. Además, estamos en una situación política y social crítica en Reino Unido y en Europa, motivada por el proceso del Brexit, que ella también comenta habitualmente con nosotros. Esa situación difícil que se plantea ahora mismo en Reino Unido y en Europa. Bueno, sin más, muchísimas gracias, profesora Riddell, por estar aquí, y suya es la palabra.
Okay. I think I'll stand up and I hope that you can hear me. Obviously, I am talking in English and I will try to speak fairly slowly. If anybody wants to stop me to ask questions, you are very welcome to, and at the end we will have some questions. So, what I am going to do today is to give you an overview of the situation of children with additional support needs in Scotland and how that relates to issues of social justice. So this is the structure of the presentation. Just to start off with, I want to say something about the broad approach to social justice in Scotland. I think in Scotland and probably across Europe, we have at the moment a big commitment to improving social justice. There are many official statements and policies and so on. But of course, there is a difference between having laws and writing policies and actually making a difference on the ground, in classrooms, in schools. And I think in Scotland, we always see ourselves as different from England. Scotland sees itself as a much more of a socialist, collectivist type of country. And we always like to think that we are more equal than is the case in England. Of course, sometimes the rhetoric and the reality are not particularly well aligned. And when we look at the data, we find that the patterns of inequalities, of social inequalities, are actually more similar than different between England and Scotland. So I'm going to say something about additional support needs and the connections between social class or social deprivation, socioeconomic status, whatever language we use, and also gender, because these things are very, very closely linked. And one of the paradoxes of being identified as having additional support needs is that on the one hand, it may bring greater resources, greater support, but on the other hand, it may lead to stigmatization and social exclusion. So it is not necessarily a good thing to be identified as having additional support needs. It depends quite a lot on the category, the particular label that is attached. So the sort of research that I do typically uses both statistics and also combines that with qualitative research in the classroom, looking at what happens on the ground in schools and in classrooms, listening to people's stories. And I will give you some examples in the presentation of both the statistics and the story that they tell, but also what happens, what this means in people's lives. So first of all, I wanted to tell you something about what we mean in Scotland by additional support needs. So round about 2004, the Scottish Government introduced legislation which replaced the terminology. We used to talk about special educational needs, and that traditional terminology, which is very similar to what you have in Spain, tended to include children with learning difficulties and disabilities, physical and sensory disabilities. But the term additional support needs is much, much broader. So it includes all types of social difficulties as well as learning difficulties and disabilities. So it includes many different children. For example, children whose parents have problems with drugs or alcohol addictions, children who do not have English as their first language, so recent immigrants, young carers, children who have caring responsibilities, children who are looked after by the local authority, we call them care experienced children, children who may have experienced bereavement, and the list goes on and on. It is now enormously broad. And of course, that is quite controversial as well, because, for example, including children who do not have English as their first language, of course, most children in this group do not have learning difficulties or disabilities. So is it right to group them with the other children who do have learning difficulties and disabilities? In England, these children are not included in the group of children with special educational needs. And there is a danger, possibly, of some degree of racism if they are counted as having learning difficulties and disabilities. In the US, for example, it is the whole issue of special educational needs is very caught up in the issue of race, and there are big concerns about overcounting children who are from African American backgrounds, so, black backgrounds. So again, this is very controversial, who is counted and who is not counted. And counting more and more children is not necessarily, in my view, a good thing. Then we start to split it into even smaller groups. So there are concerns about children with complex additional support needs, who may require support from health and social work, as well as education. As I will point out in a minute, now about 27% of children in Scotland are counted as having additional support needs. In some schools, almost half the school population. So what does that mean in that case? There certainly are not enough additional resources to go round, so the terminology may not be helpful. This figure compares what has been happening in England and in Scotland. In England, the terminology of special educational needs, SEN, is still used. The red line is England and the blue line is Scotland. And you can see that in Scotland, since 2007, the numbers of children, the proportion of the age group identified as having additional support needs has gone up year on year. It was 5% in 2007. It is now above 25%. In England, on the other hand, a deliberate decision was made to reduce the number of children who were being counted as having special educational needs. So they decided that they would not count children who were having difficulties with literacy and numeracy. They said what those children need is better teaching, not to have special needs identified. So you can see that the lines have gone in the opposite direction. And sometimes in Scotland, we believe that simply saying a child has additional support means that that child is having extra support. But in fact, because of the economic crisis and austerity, which you know about in Spain, we are actually employing fewer teachers and fewer classroom assistants. So there are actually less resources, less additional resources, not more resources. So again, there is a problem of stigmatisation rather than help. So now what I want to do is look a little bit at these connections between gender, social class, and additional support needs or disability, because I believe we should never look at categories in isolation. All of us have complex identities. So you may be Spanish, Castilian, you may be white, you may be male or female, you may come from different social class backgrounds. And we should always try and look at how these categories overlap, interact, intersect with each other. We always tend to look at one aspect of identity, but I think it is very important to try and look at how these different things intersect. So first of all, I wanted to say something about gender and additional support needs. And this shows that when we look at different types of plan, we find that boys are almost always in the majority. Now, just to say something about the plans that children have in school, these are actually very important because they are always connected with resources. And so I don't know if you have IEPs, individual education plans in Spain or indeed in Italy. I know that some of you come from Italy. So are you familiar with, So these are the type of plans which children have in classrooms, and it's meant to be a record of the extra help that the teacher will give to the child. So Raquel, maybe you can tell us, what is the Spanish translation of individual?
Sí, creo que el término homólogo sería la adaptación curricular individual. Ellos hablan del plan individual de aprendizaje, nosotros de la adaptación curricular individual.
Okay. These plans are probably quite important for classroom teaching, but they don't often bring any additional resource at all. The teacher is meant to meet the child's needs in the classroom. And almost all children with additional support needs are in mainstream schools. Only 1% are in special settings. Again, that is very similar to the situation in Spain and in Italy, actually. But you will see that boys predominate in almost all categories. And also, of course, the different types of plans that we count has increased. Child plans tend to be social work type plans. So if a child is having difficulties, they tend to get a child plan. And other plans include things like behaviour support plans. The only type of plan where we find that boys get more of that plan than girls are the CSP. These are the coordinated support plans. They tend to be given to children with the most significant difficulties. And they are called statutory support plans because they are backed up by legislation and they guarantee additional resources. But you can see that compared with other plans, they are very little used. And often it is the parents who push very, very hard to get these plans for the children because that allows people to argue for additional resources. And if they are not satisfied, they can take a case to a tribunal, they can appeal. So they are very important documents, but they are very little used. And it tends, I will show, that middle-class parents, people from more advantaged backgrounds, are much better at getting those plans for their children. So, this again shows a gender breakdown by male and female. And you will see that we have now many, many categories. It has hugely expanded, and now I think we have about 24 categories. And the writing is a little bit small. Raquel will let you have this presentation after if you want. But you will see that some categories are very, very low incidence. These tend to be categories like hearing impairment, visual impairment, deaf-blind, and so on. If we look at this category here, in the middle, social, emotional, and behavioural difficulties, you will see that this is a very big category, and that boys are much more likely to be identified. There are more than twice as many boys as girls in this category. And it is also a very, very stigmatised category. Children who have social, emotional and behavioural difficulties identified are very likely to be excluded from school. And quite often they end up in the criminal justice system. So these children are very problematic because partly of the way that they are treated in school. Being excluded from school is a very bad thing, as you can imagine, because of course children who don't go to school don't have anything useful to do and they end up getting into trouble. And from my point of view, it is a big problem that so many of these are boys. Scotland, although it tries to be a socially just society, has quite high rates of imprisonment of young people, and they are almost all young men from very, very disadvantaged backgrounds. So that is a problem. You can also see that English as an additional language is now a big category. In fact, it is the second largest category. And it is quite puzzling because we even identify more boys than girls in that category. You would have thought that it would be equal, but it is not. I think the only category that is pretty equal between girls and boys is probably deaf, blind, or one of those categories. But in every single category, virtually, the boys outnumber the girls. I suspect you have a similar pattern in Spain. I would be surprised if it was different, because this pattern is replicated across Europe and, of course, the US and Australia and other countries like that. And I think we need to do a lot more thinking about why we are still identifying a lot more boys as having these difficulties, particularly in what we call the non-normative categories, where professional judgment, what teachers think, is so important. And of course, there are many theories about this. Some people, like Sally Tomlinson, whose work you may know, have argued that it is because of problems in the labour market. So boys used to get work in manufacturing, in coal mines, in these sort of manual occupations. But these jobs have often disappeared. And so boys feel that they do not know what their identity, what their role is. And so they tend to get into trouble, they tend to get involved with drugs and alcohol, etc. And clearly in school, they are having a lot of problems, much more than girls. Now, in Scotland, we do have quite good data, in England too, on the social class background of children. So our government collects data on all of these things. And so it is not always published, but myself and my colleagues, we always ask the government statisticians to give us the data that they have. I suspect in Spain you do not have quite such good data, but it is a good thing, if you can, to encourage the government to collect the data, because we need to know what is happening. Anyway, the Scottish Government collects data in relation to neighbourhood deprivation. SIMD equals Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. And it is a neighbourhood definition. So it is not so much to do with the individual family, but the level of poverty in a neighbourhood. And of course that is controversial as well, because many poor children do not live in poor neighbourhoods. About 50% of poor children live in quite affluent neighbourhoods, and these statistics do not capture these children. But what these show is that children who are identified as having additional support needs are much more likely to live in the most deprived parts of Scotland, particularly on the west coast. I don't know if any of you, some of you, may have visited Scotland. And in Scotland, we find that we have a divide between the west of the country and the east of the country. Edinburgh and the east coast, including Aberdeen, until recently there have been problems with the oil industry, but generally the east of the coast of the country is much richer than the west of the country. Glasgow suffers from long-term post-industrial decline. It used to be the centre of shipbuilding, coal mining, all of these industries. A little bit like Bilbao, you will be familiar with Bilbao and the problems of post-industrialisation. It is really a problem across Europe, where the old industries have gone and we are left with nothing for many, many people to do. Very high levels of unemployment. In Glasgow, about 20% of the male population is unemployed. It is very, very, very high. In Edinburgh, it would be much, much lower, only about 5%. So huge differences. There are only 45 miles between Glasgow and Edinburgh, but the difference in terms of affluence, prosperity, is enormous. Anyway, children in poor areas tend to be identified as having additional support needs, but not necessarily getting more resources. Often children in richer areas get more resources, and that is very unfair. But the children who live in the richer areas are much more likely to have a statutory support plan. That is the pale blue line right at the bottom. If we compare IEPs, individualised educational plans, we find, as we would expect, that those in the most deprived areas are more likely to have an IEP than children in the least deprived areas. That is a pattern we would expect. But when we look at CSPs, these are the plans that guarantee additional support, we find that there is really not much difference. And in fact, sorry, it is a little bit faint on here, the blue line is not that visible, but we find counterintuitively that children in the least deprived areas are more likely to be getting support than children in the poor areas, even though it is in the poor areas that children are being identified as having additional support needs. So you know the Matthew principle, to those that hath shall be given. This is exactly what happens in relation to additional support needs, because parents, middle-class parents, know how to talk to teachers. They know how to talk to psychologists. And so they are able to argue that their children need extra support. But parents who come from poor backgrounds, who have very little money, do not have the cultural capital and the economic capital to argue for additional resources. Sometimes, for example, parents who have money actually pay themselves for psychological assessments. And they are also able to hire lawyers, abogadas, to take cases to the courts so that they say to the schools and the local authorities, if you do not give my child more support, we will sue you, we will take you to court. And that is the reason that their children get the most support. And of course, it is understandable that as a parent, you argue for your child. All of us as parents would argue for our children to get more resources. We would do whatever we could. So we need to give parents from poor backgrounds much, much more help so that they too can get the support that their children need. So we use this term disproportionality. And this is a big thing in the US as well, where people are very concerned about black young people being disproportionately identified as having special needs. So we find that overall, twice as many boys as girls are identified as having additional support needs. Additional support needs are twice as likely to be identified in pupils living in the most deprived neighbourhoods. So it's boys in deprived areas who are being identified. And it is also the label that is attached that is problematic. Social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. I expect you have a similar label in Spanish. These are the children who are getting identified. They do not particularly get more help. They are excluded from school, often excluded from the labour market, and they often end up in the criminal justice system from a fairly young age. By way of contrast, children who live in rich areas are much less likely to have social, emotional and behavioural difficulties identified. they tend to be identified with less stigmatised categories like dyslexia, for example. In the UK, this has become not so much a stigmatised category. It is actually a category, a label that people actively seek by getting a psychological assessment and so on. So these are the children who are getting advantaged in terms of support. So what do the qualitative data show us about what this means in terms of people's stories, people's biographies? It is always important, as I said, not just to look at the numbers, but the stories, the narratives that lie behind the numbers. And of course, whatever disability you have, it is always a disadvantage. There is always discrimination in society. In Scotland, for example, we find that across the whole population, we have at least 80% employment. I think it is a bit lower in Spain. But amongst the disabled population, we only have 50% employment. The employment rate is much lower. So we have to remember that, obviously, disability still equals disadvantage. But the disadvantage experienced by those from poorer backgrounds is much, much greater than the disadvantage experienced by those from more affluent backgrounds. So these things go together. So we have done many different studies looking at different aspects of additional support needs. And one of the studies that we did was of young people who were deaf, who had a hearing impairment or were deaf. And these were young people in transition into the world of work, training and higher education. And again, we found a big connection between social class and their experiences. So this is a short account of one young woman who we called Leah. So Leah was a full-time mum, quite a young woman, and she was a sign language user. So she was diagnosed with hearing loss when she was very, very little, a toddler. And she, when we spoke to her, was living in a peripheral housing estate in an area of high social deprivation. I think she lived on the west coast of Scotland. She lived with her partner, and she already had an 18-month-old child herself. And both her partner and the baby were deaf. The whole family was deaf. But her parents and siblings were able to hear. That was a problem with communication, even within the family. So she, like many young people who are deaf in Scotland, she had gone to a mainstream school. Well, she'd started off, in fact, initially in a special school. And she did find that that did not work especially well for her. She had a bad experience in the special school because the teachers had very low expectations of the children. And she was very unhappy, and even in the special school, she did not feel much of a connection. Anyway, she moved to a mainstream school with a unit, a special unit, and she actually felt that that was better because the work was much more challenging. Anyway, she did not get much support from her family, and she decided suddenly to leave school in the 4th year of secondary education. She did a vocational course in beauty therapy, which she enjoyed, but it was something she had chosen at random. It wasn't something she had given a great deal of thought to. She didn't really have any good careers guidance or support. And at the time of the interview, both Leah and her partner were unemployed. They didn't have work, and neither of them had any idea about what they were going to do. So they were stuck in a very, very difficult social situation. Other deaf young people we spoke to, who came from more advantaged backgrounds, were actually doing much, much better. They had had a lot of support from family and friends, and it was clear that social networks were very important in helping them get into university and then in helping them make the connections to get a job after university. So these students, the young people who were deaf from advantaged backgrounds, were doing just as well in the labour market as other young people who were not disabled. There was a very big contrast. And this is another example of what tends to happen in school. This is an example of a family, I call the lady Mrs. McHarris, who was again a single parent. This woman was again from quite a poor background. So she had one child, and the child was identified at primary school quite early as having obsessive compulsive disorder. We have more and more and more labels. Anyway, this is the label that was given to him, also dyspraxia and dyslexia. And his mum didn't have a proper job. She did what she called taking in ironing. She just did little things to try to earn some money. And her son was often away from school. He was often sent home from school, and the school said he was badly behaved and he was unofficially excluded. They just told him to stay at home, which is not legal, but it happens quite a lot. So the school really denied that he had a problem. They said he was lazy and he just didn't work. And he was, in fact, becoming increasingly distressed. This is what happens to children when their difficulties are not properly recognised at school. So he, and this is more usual amongst girls than boys, was beginning to self-harm, to cut his arms. He was in a very, very bad state. He was also compulsively washing his hands all the time. And it was very distressing for his mother that her child was exhibiting very disturbed behaviour. But the school just thought he was naughty, lazy, and they were not helping him at all. There was a slightly positive end to this story because this child transferred to secondary, and in fact at secondary he was getting better support than he had at primary. And his mum, Mrs. McHarris, found that the teachers at the secondary school were better at listening. But she felt that the primary school teachers had displayed a very callous attitude. These were the words that she used. And it is very easy for a teacher, and you of course will be teachers yourselves, when you are in a classroom, the children that the teachers find most difficult to include are not children with sensory impairments, children who are blind or deaf or have a physical difficulty. People are usually very, very sympathetic to children with those types of difficulties. The children that the teachers don't want to have in school are children with behavioural difficulties. They want to get rid of them to special units. And often they do not understand that the child's behaviour is because of many difficulties with poverty, sometimes with quite poor parenting. And they just see that that child is making their life very difficult. And so there is often a very big lack of understanding between teachers and parents. And Mrs. McHarris herself was not a very good example. She would go into the school and shout at the teacher. And so the teacher did not want to speak to the parent because they thought that she was very aggressive. Whereas another parent from a middle-class background, a professional background, might be able to talk to the teacher at the same level and establish a rapport. So you can see how these social inequalities play out every day in children's school experiences. This is what we found across many, many studies. It's a quote from a colleague of mine. The social networks and advocacy power of parents are very closely related to their socioeconomic status. They play a significant role in shaping the young people's experience of school education, as well as their post-school journeys. So we find that really the support that parents give to children continues all the way through university. It is financial support, but it is also emotional and social support. If a child is having difficulty, the parent steps in to support them. And children from poorer backgrounds very often do not get that type of support. So to come to a conclusion, the issues and challenges, it is very important for us to realise that children with additional support needs, special educational needs, are not a homogeneous group. They have different impairments which lead to different needs. They come from different social backgrounds. They have different gender identities and, of course, different racial identities. I haven't talked about this a lot, but particularly in some parts of the country, this is very important as well. Pupils with ASN very often come from socially deprived backgrounds, and they suffer from lack of supportive social networks. So there is a very strong intersection between disability, social class and gender. And we must always take into account all of these things. Yeah, please.
What does it mean, impairment?
Impairment?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so an impairment is a type of difficulty. It is language, I think, that is drawn from the disability movement. It is quite interesting that we use different words which signify different things. So in the past, many, many years ago, we might have talked about, for example, mental retardation as being a category. And in fact, they still do in the US. The US still uses the language of mental retardation. In the UK, that language is definitely not used. The social model of disability, which you may be familiar with, says that we must always take into account children's environment, because disability never exists outside a social environment. Something which may be a disability, like having poor eyesight, many of us wear glasses, for example. If we didn't have glasses, we would be disabled. We have glasses, we are not disabled. It's very simple. But the social model of disability, disability activists say, we should not forget that there may be an underlying impairment. So we don't want to talk about deficits, but we do need to recognise that some children and older people face challenges, because that enables us to make adjustments, to put in place different resources to help people. So it is a fine balance. We do not want to stigmatise people, but we have to recognise that some people experience additional challenges. So impairment, I think, refers to the cognitive or physical or sensory challenge that some people face. And I would not use the terminology unless it was actually approved by people within the disability movement. It is always important to listen to the language that people themselves want to use, to make sure that we do not use stigmatising language. Anyway, thank you for that question. It's a good question. Moving on to the little bits of qualitative data I presented, I think that the statistical data are important, but the stories are also important. We must look at both to develop a proper understanding. And the conclusions. We still have major disproportionalities. I suspect it is the same word in Spanish. You will recognise that word, yeah. Sometimes longer words are easier than shorter words. So we have these big disproportionalities, and in my view, we will be moving towards a more equal society when we have fewer disproportionalities. It is not right that children from poor backgrounds are much more likely to experience certain sorts of difficulties. And in fact, disability across the population is associated with social class. Even mental health difficulties, which we recognise a lot more. If you live in a poor area, you are much more likely to experience anxiety and depression. And these are the major causes of disability in our more affluent societies. Certainly in the UK, mental health difficulties are the major reason why people are not in employment. People leave work because of depression and anxiety. And so we have major problems to tackle there. In school, it is children with social and emotional and behavioural difficulties who become the next generation of people who are more likely to be unemployed. And here, there is a real problem with boys. I think there has not been enough attention to the gendered nature of additional support needs. In the UK, it used to be that boys did better at school and that boys were more likely to have jobs than women. Now we have the reverse situation. So girls are doing much better at school than boys, and women are more likely to have jobs. It's to do with the transition from an economy that was to do with manufacturing to an economy that is much more to do with services. You probably have the same issue in Spain. But there is always a danger that instead of saying it is a problem with the economy, we stigmatise and we blame young people and older people. And we say, the reason you don't have a job is because you are not employable, you don't have the right attitude, you don't have the right skills. But in my view, it is much more likely to be a problem with lack of jobs, insufficient opportunities in the labour market. And I think this is a problem right across Europe that the EU, all of our countries, need to tackle. So that is everything that I wanted to say, except I notice I have one more slide. We do have this official commitment to social justice, but we are not actually making it happen in reality. We pay lip service, rhetoric, the discourse is of social justice, but grassroots practice is different. And as I have already said, I think a lot of the problem is to do with the labour market rather than problems with individual children in schools. But teachers, through the attitudes, are very, very important. And I think that when you become, many of you will become teachers in the future, and your attitudes will make a really big difference to what happens to the children that you work with, and of course their parents too. Okay, thank you. That is the end.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheila Riddell. Ahora vamos a tener un rato de charla coloquio aprovechando esta magnífica exposición que nos ha hecho la profesora sobre la situación de los alumnos con necesidades adicionales de apoyo educativo en Escocia, que el término es similar a nuestro concepto de necesidades específicas de apoyo educativo. Creo que nos tenemos que animar todos a participar en el coloquio, independientemente de nuestro nivel de inglés, que ello no suponga un problema para intervenir, para preguntar. Tenemos aquí con nosotros, que antes se me ha olvidado, disculpa Tania, presentar a Tania. Ella es estudiante de la clase de segundo de educación primaria, de la clase, y se ha ofrecido a ayudarnos con la posible traducción si es necesario. Por tanto, que nadie deje de participar en el coloquio porque su nivel de inglés no sea bueno. Intentad preguntar o hablar en inglés, pero si os da vergüenza o no podéis por los nervios o por lo que sea, preguntad en español, que Tania os ayudará, o incluso yo misma, pero que También os digo de antemano que mi inglés no es bueno y aquí estamos haciendo el esfuerzo de compartir experiencias y conocimientos con nuestra colega británica. ¿De acuerdo? Os animo, por favor, a que intervengáis, a que aprovechéis para preguntar a la profesora, para que hagamos un coloquio, pasemos un buen rato de conversación.
Thank you so much. And I want to know if you think that we need more information as a future teacher to use a more inclusive methodology in the classroom.
Yes. I believe that many of you are training to be teachers at the moment. You are preparing to be teachers. And you will find when you work as teachers that you will definitely have children who have special needs in your classrooms. And many people believe that they need special training to teach children effectively. And sometimes there is definitely a need for some expertise. So, for example, children who have autistic spectrum disorder, for example, there may be special things, expertise that is needed. Children who are deaf, for example, it may be that these children want to use sign language and there is need for expertise. But many difficulties are possible, quite possible, for the teacher to deal with without special help. Very often, if the teacher just does good teaching, differentiates the curriculum, that will work for all children in the class. Sometimes teachers feel that there is some special magical solution, but there isn't really, I don't think.
¿Alguien necesita que traduzcamos lo que ha dicho la profesora o la pregunta que ha hecho Adrián? Creo que no, ¿verdad? O, si es necesario, de verdad, no tengáis vergüenza, preguntad que... Sí, sí.
Maybe better without. Better without, I think.
I'm interested in one question, in few questions actually. The first one, who decides whether the child belongs to the group of ASN?
Okay, that is a very good question. Did you all hear the
¿Habéis oído
question?
la pregunta?
No.
Who decides, how is it that a child comes to be identified as having additional support needs? And the answer actually is, there is very often, no official assessment system. It is very often up to the teacher in the classroom to decide which children. In Scotland, we have a shortage, not enough, educational psychologists. And very often, children do not have a psychological assessment or a medical assessment. It may be that a child who has very, very complex needs will have a medical assessment or a psychological assessment at an early age. For example, some babies, it is very obvious that this child has difficulties. Often children who are born very prematurely, for example, have major difficulties as they get older. But these are a very small proportion of the population, maybe only 0.1%. For the big group of children, up to 27% of the population, this is really down to teachers in the classroom deciding. And I think it is really often quite random. So in different classrooms, you get big differences in rates of identification. And we have big differences between local authorities as well. We have looked at the rates of identification in different local authorities, provincias, municipalities, and we find that in some it is as high as 35%, more than a third of the population. And I think it's quite problematic, actually, when you have such different rates of identification. It's also, of course, a problem if a child, their family, moves from one bit of the country to another. Because in one bit of the country, you may have needs identified, in another bit, not. So it is fairly variable. The statistics, when you look at, people always think that numbers are very hard, but in fact, when you look at how they are put together, they are not really, they're very soft data.
So the teachers usually knows about the problem during the educational process, not before the child goes to the school.
Yes, most identification happens while a child is at school. So many difficulties, for example, dyslexia, will not become apparent until a child is learning to read. So it will definitely be after a child starts school.
¿Habéis entendido bien la situación? La mayoría de las dificultades se detectan en la escuela. Los maestros en ese campo, pues tenéis, los futuros maestros, también mucha responsabilidad. Se detectan en la escuela. Otra dificultad que pueden encontrar en Reino Unido es la diferente organización de las autoridades educativas. Aquí en España nos organizamos por regiones o por provincias, pero en Reino Unido se organizan por autoridades locales de educación, similar a lo que aquí serían los ayuntamientos. Y además, como veis, es diferente la normativa en Inglaterra y en Escocia, de manera que si una autoridad local te ha reconocido que entras dentro del grupo de necesidades de apoyo educativo, si tú te trasladas con tu familia a otra zona de Reino Unido, puedes encontrar que allí no te reconozcan que tienes necesidades educativas. Ese es un problema grande, ¿no?, que ellos encuentran. Unido a que, si no he entendido mal, ellos tienen necesidad de tener más psicólogos educativos que ayuden a la detección de los niños y niñas con necesidades adicionales de apoyo. En ese sentido, nosotros tenemos quizás una situación más establecida con los equipos de orientación educativa que diagnostican a los niños con necesidades educativas especiales, pero en algunos casos también tenemos pocos profesionales. Ya sabéis también que la crisis económica nos ha hecho mucho daño y los recortes que están haciendo en educación nuestro gobierno pues está afectando a todo esto también. ¿Más preguntas? Diego?
I know that
No.
Okay, I know that in England it's usual to have like 3 different curricular levels within the syllabi. My question is that the case in Scotland?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I know in England it's quite usual that you have a 3-level syllabus design. So within the same class, you work in 3 different levels.
Okay.
Is that the case in Scotland too?
Well, in Scotland, we have a new curriculum. It is called Curriculum for Excellence. It says it is excellent, but I am not sure. And definitely there are different levels. One set of exams is called National 5, and one set of exams is called National 4. So there are almost 2 levels, and children are differentiated. Personally, I think that this is a bad thing. It is not a good idea to split children into different groups. One of the problems in Scotland and in the rest of the UK is that even in primary school, children tend to get grouped by ability from a very, very early age. And of course, the teachers call it something like lions and tigers and hippopotamuses or something, but the children always know. And the teachers do it because they want to be able to allow some children to progress faster. But I think it is a bad thing because some children develop a very negative view of what they can achieve. When I was teaching myself, I taught mixed ability. Do you understand that term, mixed ability? Yeah? So children, right up to the final exams, were all in the same class. And we had children in the classes who had learning difficulties, quite serious learning difficulties, and children who were obviously going to do very, very well and go on to university. And I think there is quite strong evidence that it is good to keep children together for as long as you can. Systems like Germany, for example, that split children into vocational and academic tracks at an early age, tend to have big social divisions emerging. So that is really, I think, not a good thing to do. But there are strong pressures in every system to make that happen.
I have a question for you. And you said... Vale. Bueno, hablo más alto. Okay. I would like to know that you say that in England they decided to reduce the number of children with special educational needs. And I would like to know if it's something just because of statistics or a government idea. Why is that happening?
Yes, okay. I think these things are always quite complicated. So it was the school inspectorate, and you will have inspectors in Spanish schools as well, that said too many children are being identified as having special needs. But I think there was a financial thing underpinning it as well, because in England, if a child had special educational needs identified, the school got extra money. And so they thought that they would reduce expenditure by identifying fewer children. So again, this is the paradox of special educational needs. If it enables extra resources to be spent, extra money to come into schools, then okay, that's fine. But at the same time, children are stigmatised by having special needs identified. So I don't really know. In England, there is big, and of course in Scotland as well, parents are often very dissatisfied with provision. They say it is always a struggle to get extra support for your child. Unless you are prepared to take on the system, to do battle, go into battle, you do not get anything. And it is a pity that it is such a struggle. It would be better if it was more automatic, I think. So in England, there have been many television programmes and so on about parents saying, my child is struggling, my child is so unhappy, there are not enough extra resources. And as I said already, it is the middle class parents who are much better at working the system to their advantage. Mm-hmm.
If the Brexit happens, how we will
Perfect.
If the Brexit happens, how will it affect the education in the Europe?
Sorry, say that again. Just repeat the question, please.
How will the Brexit affect the
Okay.
education
Yeah.
in the UK?
Okay. Well, personally, I think that Brexit is a terrible idea. I voted to remain in the EU, and as you will know, the referendum, it was a bad idea to have a referendum on such an important question when most people did not know what they were voting for. Apparently on Google searches, you know Google, the search engine, the most common question asked in the UK the day after the referendum was, what is the EU? So, you know, people didn't really not understand what they were voting for. I think there is a real problem that the UK will end up poorer. And of course, it is always people at the bottom who suffer. For rich people, it makes little difference. If you have a little bit less money, well, so what? You have plenty of money. But for people at the bottom, having a bit less money makes a huge difference. And I'm very concerned that we will have more austerity as a result, less money spent on education, and of course on health as well. The health service is struggling at the moment to try to survive with the level of funding. So we will have more problems and more social unrest as a result. It was often people with lower levels of education who voted for Brexit because they were expressing discontent with their lives. But I think it will make life worse for that group. So it is a pity, to put it mildly.
Sí. ¿Se ha entendido bien la respuesta de la profesora de la importancia que tiene el Brexit, de lo preocupados que están en el Reino Unido con el Brexit, de cómo muchos de los... Ella misma dice que votó no Brexit, que votó a favor de quedarse en la Unión Europea, y cómo posiblemente si el Brexit se lleva a cabo, la educación se resentirá porque los presupuestos serán menores, así entendido, si no, sí, si no he entendido mal, ¿no?
Y que aunque mucha gente queda de pues eso, una economía menor, la habían votado, realmente sería peor salir adelante porque ese grupo social, por así llamarlo, ¿no? Que tengamos una economía más baja, se verían más afectados. Porque al fin de cuentas, si tienes dinero para poder gastarlo en un apoyo para tu hijo, pero si no lo tienes, pues no puedes.
People were told during the referendum campaign that there will be much more money to spend on health, for example. They had campaign buses with 350 million more pounds for the National Health Service after Brexit. And of course, there is no more money for the National Health Service. In fact, there is less money for the National Health Service. So people were told many, many things that were not true.
¿Habéis entendido? Sí. Realmente la gente votó cosas que se prometían que no eran ciertas. Más dinero para el Sistema Nacional de Salud si se sale de la Unión Europea, y eso no es cierto. Es un problema grande. Pedro, tenías una pregunta.
Hello. I just want you to know if it's possible to sensibilizar, no sé decirlo en a classroom to make the pupils know that there's a person who has special needs. I don't think you know what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment in Scotland we are having a big debate about inclusion and how well inclusion is working. There was a law from 2000, the year 2000, which said there is a presumption of inclusion. So we presume that a child with special needs will be placed in a mainstream school unless there are very good reasons for a special school placement. But at the moment in Scotland, Scotland has been performing worse on PISA tests. Are you familiar with PISA? It is an OECD measure of literacy, numeracy, etc. And politicians look very closely at how their country is performing. It is often big headlines if you are doing better or worse. Anyway, Scotland is now doing worse than England. So this is regarded as a terrible scandal because Scotland always has to do better than England. And so the teachers in Scottish schools have been told, you must raise standards. But the teachers are now saying, well, we cannot raise standards because we have to educate children with special needs. Mainstreaming policy inclusion is not working. We must get rid of these children. We must send them to special units somewhere else. So the Scottish Government is now having a consultation on inclusion. And I think that this is probably quite a damaging thing. I think it is unlikely that we will suddenly create a lot more special schools, because actually special schools are very, very expensive to run compared with mainstream schools. But I think it is indicative of tensions within the system. Teachers saying, bargaining, if you want us to improve standards, you must get rid of the children, particularly those with behavioural difficulties. These are the children we do not want in our classrooms. And of course, you cannot just get rid of children with behavioural difficulties. It is much more important to try to understand why those children are having behavioural difficulties and what we can do to help the children, not to send them off somewhere else. Putting children with behavioural difficulties together anyway is a very bad idea because it compounds the difficulties. It makes things worse, not better.
Sí, bueno, habéis entendido un poco también la pelea secular entre Inglaterra y Escocia, ¿no? Siempre están ahí. Dice, bueno, pues si en PISA los ingleses sacan mejor nota, nosotros tenemos también que sacar mejor nota porque no puede ser esto, ¿eh? Entonces, bueno, eso es un problema para la inclusión, porque si tienes niños con necesidades educativas en clase, en PISA no puntúas igual de alto, ¿no? Eso está perjudicando a la inclusión. Sí, bueno, más o menos. Y en cuanto a lo que decías sobre la pregunta de cómo ayudar a sensibilizar, puede ser, ¿verdad? Sí, puedes hacer la pregunta.
How, if we were teachers, how or what can we do to help those people and to work inclusion in the classroom?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it is a balance when you are a teacher. You have to recognise when children are having difficulties. But you also have to have a belief that all children can learn. There is always a tendency in Scotland, I would say, and probably elsewhere, to believe that children from poorer backgrounds cannot do as well as children from richer backgrounds. It is almost like an environmental determinism. People believe that the social background of children overrides everything else. And that is quite a dangerous belief because it produces expectations. So as a teacher in the classroom, I think it is important to have high expectations for all children, but also to be able to differentiate the curriculum so that sometimes children are given work at different levels and you encourage children all the time. It is more work for the teacher, of course. You don't just give every child exactly the same thing to do. In Scotland as well, and in the UK, we have been helped a lot by having more classroom assistants in school. These are people who are not qualified teachers, but people who work with children with special educational needs. And sometimes people think that this is not a good thing because if the teacher just hands the children to the classroom assistant, obviously that is not good for their education. But sometimes it is essential when you're doing small group work to have more than one adult in the classroom. And I don't know how usual that is in Spain. Do you often have classroom assistants?
Que si tenemos en España lo que llaman ellos classroom assistant, que es un profesional que está siempre trabajando con el profesor tutor. No, nosotros tenemos support teacher that work with main teacher.
Yes.
Some hours a day. But not all day.
Okay. Because in the UK, well, when I was teaching, there was no classroom, there was no learning support teacher, no classroom assistant, one teacher for the whole class. And that was quite hard, actually. But now we have learning support teacher, maybe only one for the whole school. But we also, when we have particular children with difficulties, we often have a classroom assistant, or maybe two classroom assistants, in the classroom. And actually that works much better. So for example...
Full-time.
Yeah. So if a child with autistic spectrum disorder maybe is distressed, is upset, then the classroom assistant can help, sometimes by taking the child out from the classroom so that the child may calm down and then they may rejoin the class. I think it is really difficult to do inclusion if you only have one teacher responsible for everybody all the time in the classroom. That is a tough job.
We think so.
You think so too, yes, it is.
Yeah. ¿Hay alguna pregunta por aquí?
In relation with this question, most of all, we are students of the degree of primary education teaching, and the next year we have to decide which major to study. There is English major, French major, and there's also special education major. Do you believe that this major has to exist, or that all teachers have to be taught in these special needs?
I think that is a really, really good question. And I think it would be a very good thing if all of you did the special needs unit. Of course, the languages unit is very important as well. So maybe you could do both. But I think it is a mistake to think that only some teachers need to know about special needs. In fact, all of you in primary school will have some children who have difficulties in your classroom. So all of you really should do this option. It shouldn't be an option, it should be compulsory. That is my belief.
¿Estás de acuerdo, Patricia, con lo que dice la profesora?
Yeah. But it is a very good question, and it is the same criticism that is made of Scottish teacher education. We don't spend enough time on additional support needs, preparation of teachers. And we don't have enough CPD later training when teachers have maybe taught for a few years. It would be good to have additional courses at that point, but teachers don't get enough support generally in terms of continuous professional development. One of the things that I observe of this group is that there are quite a lot of young men who are training to be primary teachers. This is a very, very good thing. In Scotland, about 80%, it is very good. In Scotland, about 80% or even more of primary school teachers are women, not men. So it is good to have a gender mix in primary school education.
Bueno, habéis visto que os está piropeando a los chicos, porque estáis estudiando para ser maestros de primaria. Que no se me olvide este año enviaros un artículo de periódico, una carta de periódico que escribió una maestra hace muchos años, dando la bienvenida a los maestros de educación infantil. que en este caso también era la educación primaria, diciendo algo así como, chicos, los niños también os necesitan a vosotros, los chicos, porque no solo las chicas, las maestras dan cariño a los niños, también vosotros, los chicos, tenéis que estar en la escuela, ¿no? Una cosa muy bonita, que no se me olvide enviarosla. Y bueno, pues que os felicita por ser tantos chicos. Que allí en Escocia habéis oído el 80% del profesorado son maestras. Aquí también en España la proporción es muy alta. Pero sí que es verdad que es bonito ver muchos chicos en las clases de magisterio en primaria y en educación infantil. Antes no había, está creciendo. Está creciendo el número de...
And it is a really, really good job to do. It is a really important job to do because you have a real opportunity to make a difference to children's lives.
Bueno, no sé si tenéis alguna pregunta más que hacer a la profesora. ¿Sí? A que tienen un examen. Hay gente que tiene... They are people that have an exam.
Oh, yeah, fine. Best of luck with your exam.
Buena suerte. Sí, Diego.
Okay, I'm just curious to know about what has been the impact of the increasing of the Polish population in Edinburgh, especially in areas such as Leith for the last 15 years. Is it still increasing, or the tendency has changed? And what sort of impact do you think it has had in the schools of that kind of more difficult neighborhoods?
Police. You said police, yeah. No.
No, I was in Leith.
Oh, Leith. Sorry, okay. So, can you just increase population? Did you say, or
no, the Polish population?
Oh, the Polish population, right? The Polish population, right. In fact, as I said, Polish children get identified as having additional support needs, not because they have learning difficulties or disabilities, but because they need extra support. And in fact, children who come from other European countries, and indeed from further afield, are often make a big improvement in the standard of education. Polish parents who come to the UK are very ambitious for their children, and the children learn English very, very quickly and do very well in school. So it's very good, actually. In London, it is often the case in other countries that children from immigrant backgrounds do worse in school. But in London, children from immigrant backgrounds do very well in schools. And the standards in London schools have gone up a lot because of the children from immigrant backgrounds raising standards. So generally, immigration has been very good for the UK in its education system, but also in economically, socially, culturally. It's been a good thing.
Bueno, hay que decir que la profesora Riddell es una entusiasta defensora de la igualdad y de la justicia social y de la defensa de la población migrante en Reino Unido. Realmente, quizás aquí tenemos la percepción de que los británicos no quieren a los inmigrantes, nos están vendiendo esa idea con el Brexit, pero no es cierto, o sea, ocurre como en todos los sitios. Hay mucha gente que defiende la multiculturalidad y que dice, inmigrantes, vosotros sois bienvenidos en el Reino Unido. Una de esas personas es la profesora Riddell, que defiende, como digo, la diversidad.
You obviously know a lot about Scotland. Have you been there?
I used to live in Edinburgh, yes.
Ah, okay, yeah. And did you like it? Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. It's like second home.
Yeah. I was saying to Raquel that in Edinburgh, it is a smallish city, 500,000 people, but we have 40,000 young Spanish people in Edinburgh. There is a huge Spanish population, and of course a very big Polish population, even bigger. Polish is the biggest immigrant group in Edinburgh. So I do encourage you all to come to Edinburgh.
40.000 españoles en Edimburgo, la mayoría de ellos jóvenes, ¿eh? Y yo lo he visto. Hay muchísimos jóvenes y jóvenes, iba a decir, jóvenes españoles allí con quienes puedes hablar, y ellos te cuentan su experiencia en Escocia, cómo además los escoceses son muy acogedores, tú lo sabes, Diego, si has vivido allí, Scottish people are very, very friendly with migrants. Y realmente es una ciudad y un país muy, muy acogedor para los inmigrantes. No sé si tu experiencia fue así.
Sí, vamos, especially if you compare with England.
Yeah.
I mean, in North England, like Manchester area or in Scotland, I felt far more welcome than I was in South England.
Okay. Did you also live in the south of England, in London?
I just did a month as a trainee in a London school.
Yeah. Okay.
And the attitude, the university mates, and the initial attitude of the teacher was like, well, you know, you're Spaniard, you don't know what you're doing, you know, we have you here.
Yes.
As a pet.
Okay. That is a pity. And of course the Scottish like to think that they are much more hospitable and welcoming than the English. However, I would say that we should always be careful of these cultural stereotypes. I think London is an amazing city because 50% of the population was not born in the UK. If you go to London, it is hugely culturally diverse, and generally people get on very, very well. It is an amazing city because it is so cosmopolitan. It is a very, very rich city culturally. And of course, there are some problems with terrorism, as there are everywhere. But by and large, people work very well and live very well together. And that's the important thing to hang on to. Some of the biggest problems with immigration actually have been in the northern cities where there is more poverty. And so, for example, I come from a little town called Boston, the original Boston in Lincolnshire. It is a little town on the east coast. It is mainly, it's quite close to Cambridge actually. It is in the middle of agricultural land, and the population, when I grew up, the population was about 25,000. And then it got much bigger, with many people from Portugal and from Poland, big waves of immigration. And so the population grew very, very rapidly, and the local population was not used to diversity. When I grew up, you hardly ever saw anybody from another part of the world. There were no black people at all. And so people in Boston were quite hostile to immigrants. And in fact, in the referendum, the Brexit vote, people in Boston were most likely to vote leave. I think about 75% of the population voted leave. In Edinburgh, where I live now, 75% of the population voted remain. It was the reverse. But it is often these poor parts of the country where there is much more anti-immigration feeling than in parts like London or Edinburgh, where there is more cultural diversity. And I am always somebody who, in Scotland, you often get people saying that in England everything is bad, people are very hostile to immigrants, but it is not universally accepting in Scotland either. We have to always be careful not to stereotype, I think.
Queda claro, ¿verdad? Que nos dice que tengamos cuidado con los estereotipos, que no todo el mundo es bueno en Escocia, no todo el mundo es bueno en Londres, en Inglaterra. Al contrario, Londres es una gran ciudad que acoge a mucha gente, hay mucha diversidad como ciudad cosmopolita que es. E incluso ella menciona que ella nació en Boston y siempre dice que es el Boston original. No el gran Boston de Estados Unidos, sino Boston, una ciudad pequeña en el sur de Inglaterra, en el sudeste de Inglaterra, que apenas tenía inmigración, apenas tenía inmigrantes. Ella nació y creció allí y eran como unas 20.000 personas y nunca no veían gente de otros países. Sin embargo, ha crecido hasta el punto de casi duplicar su población y mucha gente de allí votó irse de la Unión Europea. O sea que justo lo contrario que ha pasado en Edimburgo. Bueno, en definitiva, que podemos encontrar gente diversa en todas las partes y que tenemos que tratar de eliminar estereotipos y de realmente trabajar juntos. Ella es inglesa, trabaja en Escocia, ahora está trabajando con españoles y nosotros estamos encantados de que sea así. Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos por estar aquí.